So we are doing 2.6 in Tale of Two Cities. So this chapter is called Hundreds of People. And the chapter is taking place 4 months after we last saw Sidney Carton cry himself to sleep in 2.5. I'm going to skip around a little bit probably in this chapter. There's a whole lot of description of Dr. Manette's house, and we don't need it, but feel free to take a look at it on your own. So, the quiet lodgings of Dr. Manette were in a quiet street corner not far from Soho Square. On the afternoon of a certain fine Sunday, when the waves of 4 months had rolled over the trial for treason and carried it, as to the public interest and memory, far out to sea, so nature, weather, Mr. Jarvis Lorry walked along the sunny streets from Clerkenwell, where he lived, on his way to dine with the doctor. After several relapses into business absorption, Mr. Lorry had become the doctor's friend, and the quiet street corner was the sunny part of his life. So Manette's better. They live in a nice part of London, a quiet part of London. Things are going well. Lorry goes over there every Sunday for dinner. So it's this tradition that's happened. So on this certain fine Sunday, Mr. Lorry walked towards Soho early in the afternoon for 3 reasons of habit. First, because on fine Sundays he often walked out before dinner with the doctor and Lucy. Second, because on unfavorable Sundays he was accustomed to be out with them as the family friend, talking, reading, and looking out the window, and generally getting through the day. And thirdly, because he happened to have his own little shrewd doubts to solve, and knew how the ways of the doctor's household pointed that time as a likely time for solving them. Okay, so now I'm going to jump down to, I'm going to turn the page to 90. So just flip over to 90. And the first real paragraph there, it says, Dr. Manette received such patients here as his old reputation, so he's working again as a doctor, and its revival in the floating whispers of his story brought him. His scientific knowledge and his diligence and skill in conducting ingenious experiments brought him otherwise into moderate request, and he earned as much as he wanted. So again, mostly he's been recalled to life. These things were within Mr. Jarvis Lorry's knowledge and thoughts and notice when he rang the doorbell of the tranquil house on that fine Sunday afternoon. Dr. Manette at home? Expected home. Miss Lucy at home? Expected home. Miss Pross at home? Possibly at home, but of a certainty impossible for handmaid to anticipate intentions of Miss Pross, as to admission of denial of the fact. As I am at home myself, said Mr. Lorry, I'll go upstairs. So he walks upstairs, he walks into the house. This is again sort of part of the description of the house that we don't need, so I'm going to jump a paragraph to the bottom of 90. It said there were 3 rooms on a floor, and the doors by which they communicated being put open that the air might pass freely through them all. Mr. Lorry, smilingly observant of that fanciful resemblance which he detected all around him, walked from one to another. The first was the best room, and in it were Lucy's birds and flowers and books and desk and work table and a box of watercolors. The second was the doctor's consulting room, used also as the dining room. The third, changingly speckled by the rustle of the plane tree in the yard, was the doctor's bedroom, and there, in a corner, stood the disused shoemaker's bench and tray of tools, much as it had stood on the 5th floor of the dismal house by the wine shop in the suburb of Saint Antoine in Paris. So, as he walks in, he notices in Dr. Manette's bedroom, he's kept the shoemaking stuff, which, remember, Madame Defarge ran up and got for them as they were leaving because he decided that he wanted to have those things, so he keeps those in his bedroom. That's important for later. I wonder, said Mr. Lorry, pausing in his looking about, that he keeps that reminder of his sufferings about him. And why wonder at that, was the abrupt inquiry that made him start. It proceeded from Miss Pross, the wild red woman, strong of hand, whose acquaintance he'd first made at the Royal George Hotel at Dover, and had since improved. I should have thought, Mr. Lorry began. Pooh, you should have thought, said Miss Pross, and Mr. Lorry left off. How do you do? Inquired that lady then, sharply, and yet as if to express that she bore no malice. I'm pretty well, thank you, answered Mr. Lorry with meekness. How are you? Nothing to boast of, said Miss Pross. Indeed. Ah, Ladybird, said Miss Pross, that's what she calls Lucy. I am very much put out about my Ladybird. So she's annoyed about something. Indeed. For gracious sake, say something else besides indeed, or you'll fidget me to death. Really then, said Mr. Lorry as an amendment. Really is bad enough, returned Miss Pross, but better. Yes, I'm very much put out. May I ask the cause? I don't want dozens of people who are not at all worthy of Ladybird to come looking after her, said Miss Pross. Do dozens come for that purpose? Hundreds, said Miss Pross. So basically what she's saying is that hundreds of men come to the house looking to date Lucy, and her problem is she doesn't think that anybody's good enough for her. It was a characteristic of this lady, as of some other people before her time and since, that whenever her original proposition was questioned, she exaggerated it. So think about like hyperbole, right? An exaggeration. Hundreds of people are not actually coming to the house. Dear me, said Mr. Lorry, is the safest remark he could think of. I have lived with the darling, or the darling has lived with me, and paid for it, which she certainly should have never done, and you may take your affidavit if I could have afforded to keep either myself or for her for nothing since she was 10 years old. And it's really very hard, said Miss Pross. So it's sort of like Miss Pross is her mother. She's kind of raised her. Okay. They keep sort of talking, and I'm going to jump over to 93. So she keeps complaining about all of these men. The first real paragraph on 93, she says, there never was, nor will be, but one man worthy of Ladybird, said Miss Pross, and that was my brother Solomon, if he hadn't made a mistake in life. So, random, weird detail, file it away in the back of your mind, because it will come back. So the one guy who she thinks is worthy of marrying Lucy is her brother Solomon. So a little bit about him. Here again, Mr. Lorry's inquiries into Miss Pross's personal history had established the fact that her brother Solomon was a heartless scoundrel who had stripped her of everything she possessed as a stake to speculate with, and had abandoned her in her poverty forevermore with no touch of compunction. So her brother stole everything from her and left her, and she hasn't seen him since. But for some reason, she's saying he's the only guy who's good enough for Lucy. Weird. Miss Pross's fidelity of belief in Solomon, deducting a mere trifle for the slight mistake, was quite a serious matter with Mr. Lorry, and had its weight in his good opinion of her. As we happen to be alone for the moment, and are both people of business, he said, when they had got back to the drawing room and had sat down there in friendly relations, let me ask you, does the doctor, in talking with Lucy, never refer to the shoemaking time yet? Never. And yet keeps that bench and tools beside him? Ah, returned Miss Pross, shaking her head, but I don't say he don't refer to it within himself. Do you believe that he thinks of it much? I do, said Miss Pross. Do you imagine, Mr. Lorry had begun, when Miss Pross took him up short with, never imagine anything, have no imagination at all. I stand corrected. Do you go so far as to suppose sometimes, now and then, said Miss Pross. Do you suppose, Mr. Lorry went on with a laughing twinkle in his bright eye as he looked kindly at her, that Dr. Manette has any theory of his own, preserved through all those years, relative to the cause of his being so oppressed? Perhaps even to the name of his oppressor. So, like, does he ever talk about his time in prison, or how he got there, or why, or anything like that? I don't suppose anything about it but what Ladybird tells me, and this is that she thinks he has. Now, don't be angry at me asking all of these questions, because I am a mere dull man of business, and you are a woman of business. So, they keep talking, and I'm going to jump down on the page on 94, last paragraph. Miss Pross says, can't be helped, said Miss Pross, shaking her head. Touch that string, and he instantly changes for the worse. Better leave it alone. In short, must leave it alone, like or no like. Sometimes he gets up in the dead of the night and will be heard by us overhead there, walking up and down in his room. Ladybird has learnt to know that this is his mind walking up and down in his old prison. So when he has these relapses at night, he'll do these laps across his room, mimicking the size of his prison cell when he was in 105 North Tower. But he never says a word of the true reasons for his restlessness to her, and she finds it best not to hint at it to him. In silence they go walking up and down together, till her love and company have brought him to himself. Notwithstanding Miss Pross's denial of her own imagination, there was a perception of the pain of being monotonously haunted by one sad idea in her repetition of the phrase, walking up and down, which testified to her possessing such a thing. The corner has been mentioned as a wonderful corner for echoes. This is where they live. It had begun to echo so resoundingly to the tread of coming feet that it seemed as though the very mention of the weary pacing to and fro set it going. "Hey, there they are," said Miss Pross, rising to break up the confidence. "Now we shall have hundreds of people pretty soon." So, the house is in a part of, or on a part of the street where you can hear the echoes of footsteps. So as people are coming into the house or are walking by the house, you can hear the echoes. And think about what an echo is, right? So it's one sound that then kind of like reverberates, so it sounds like it's more. So back to like hundreds of people. So just think about that, because that's going to come up a little bit more by the end of the chapter. So the Lucy and Minette come back, and let's jump over to 96. Dinner's about to start, and let's go to the bottom of 96, and it says, "Still, the hundreds of people did not present themselves." So like Laurie's waiting this whole time to see the hundreds of men. "Still, the hundreds of people did not present themselves. Mr. Darnay presented himself while they were sitting under the plane tree, but he was only one." So now Darnay comes sometimes on these Sunday nights. Dr. Manette received him kindly, and so did Lucy, but Miss Pross suddenly became afflicted with a twitching in the head and body and retired to the house. She was not unfrequently the victim of this disorder, and she called it, in familiar conversation, a fit of the jerks. The doctor was in his best condition and looked especially young. The resemblance between him and Lucy was very strong at such times as they sat side by side, she leaning on his shoulder and he resting his arm on the back of her chair. It was very agreeable to trace the likeness. He had been talking all day on many subjects, and with usual vivacity. "Pray, Dr. Manette," said Mr. Darnay, as they sat under the plane tree, and he said it in the natural pursuit of the topic on hand, "what happened to the old buildings of London? Have you seen much of the Tower? Lucy and I have been there, but only casually. We have seen enough of it to know that it teems with interest, little more." "I have been there, as you remember," said Darnay with a smile, though reddening a little angrily, "in other character, and not in a character that gives faculties for seeing much of it. They told me a curious thing when I was last there." "What was it?" Lucy asked. So, Darnay is about to tell a story about the Tower of London, which was a prison in London. Not the Bastille. So that's important to note. He's talking about London, not France. But pay attention to what happens and pay attention to the story. So here's the story. Darnay's talking. "In making some alterations, the workmen came upon an old dungeon, which had been, for many years, built up and forgotten. Every stone of its inner wall was covered by inscriptions which had been carved by prisoners, dates, names, complaints, and prayers. Upon a cornerstone in an angle of the wall, one prisoner, who seemed to have gone to execution, had cut, at his last words, 3 letters. They were done with some very poor instrument and hurriedly with an unsteady hand. At first they were read as D-I-C, but on more careful examination, the last letter was found to be a G. There was no record or legend of any prisoner with those initials, and many fruitless guesses were made what the name could have been. At length it was suggested that the letters were not initials, but the complete word dig. The floor was examined very carefully under the inscription, and in the earth beneath a stone or tile or some fragment of paving were found the ashes of a paper mingled with the ashes of a small leathern case or bag. What the unknown prisoner had written will never be read, but he had written something and hidden it away to keep it from the jailer. So here's this random story about a random prisoner in the Tower of London who wrote dig on the wall as a message to dig something up. Think about dig in this book, sort of the metaphor of digging and what that means. And my lights go off. So the prisoner would have buried like a letter or a diary or something that he wanted people to find, kept away from his jailers. So all of a sudden, we get this story. "My father," exclaimed Lucy, "you are ill." He had suddenly started up with his hand to his head. His manner and his look quite terrified them all. "No, my dear, not ill. There are large drops of rain falling, and they made me start. We had better go in." He recovered himself almost instantly. Rain was really falling in large drops, and he showed the back of his hand with raindrops on it, but he said not a single word in reference to the discovery that he had been told of. And as they went in the house, the business eye of Mr. Lorry either detected or fancied it detected on his face, as it turned toward Charles Darnay, the same singular look that had been upon it when it turned toward him in the passages of the courthouse. So, what time is this talking about? This is when, right after the acquittal, they're all standing around congratulating Darnay on his escaping death. And remember, Manette stares at Darnay with a look of dislike, distrust, and something else, right? Where he something's going on. He doesn't like Darnay. And all of a sudden, Darnay tells this story about the Tower of London, and he has that, Mr. Lorry notices that he has that same look. So just kind of file that little detail away too. He recovered himself so quickly, however, that Mr. Lorry had doubts to his business eye. The arm of the golden giant in the hall was not more steady than he was when he stopped under it to remark to them that he was not yet proof against such slight surprises if he ever would be, and that the rain had startled him. Tea time, and Miss Pross making tea, with another fit of the jerks came upon her, and yet no hundreds of people. Mr. Carton had lounged in, but he made only 2. So, 2 people at dinner, Darnay, Carton. No surprise. The night was so very sultry or hot that, although they sat with the doors and windows open, they were overpowered by heat. When the tea table was done with, they all moved to one of the windows and looked out into the heavy twilight. Lucy sat by her father. Darnay sat beside her. Carton leaned against a window. The curtains were long and white, and some of the thunder gas that whirled into the corner caught them to the ceiling and waved them like a spectral wing. So there's a storm outside. The raindrops are still falling, large, heavy, and few, said Dr. Manette. It comes slowly. It comes surely, said Carton. They spoke low, as people watching and waiting mostly do, as people in a dark room watching and waiting for lightning always do. There was a great hurry in the streets of people speeding away to get to shelter before the storm broke. The wonderful corner for echoes resounded with the echoes of footsteps coming and going, and yet not a footstep was there. A multitude of people, and yet a solitude, said Darnay, when they had listened for a while. Is it not impressive, Mr. Darnay? Asked Lucy. Sometimes I've sat here of an evening until I have fancied, but even the shade of a foolish fancy makes me shudder tonight, when all is so black and solemn. Let us shudder too. We may know what it is. It will seem nothing to you. Such whims are only impressive as we originate them, I think. They are not to be communicated. I have sometimes sat alone here of an evening, listening, until I have made the echoes out to be the echoes of all the footsteps that are coming by and by into our lives. So, I don't want to give you the answer to this, but I want you to think about what the footsteps are supposed to represent. So there's a couple different things happening here. So what do you think all of these footsteps that are coming into their lives? Carton says, Dr. Manette says the footsteps come, or talking about the rain comes slowly. Carton says it comes surely. So the footsteps and the rain and the echoes and all of these things, think about what you think they represent. And we'll talk about it in class. Carton says, there's a great crowd coming one day into our lives, if that be so. Sidney Carton struck in his moody way. The footsteps were incessant, and the hurry of them became more and more rapid. The corner echoed and re-echoed with the tread of feet, some, as it seemed, under the windows, some, as it seemed, in the room, some coming, some going, some breaking off, some stopping, all together, all in the distant streets, not one within sight. Are all these footsteps destined to come to all of us, Miss Manette, or do we divide them among us? I don't know, Mr. Darnay. I told you it was a foolish fancy, but you asked for it. When I have yielded myself to it, I have been alone, and have imagined them the footsteps of the people who are to come into my life and my father's. I take them into mine, said Carton. I ask no questions and make no stipulations. There is a great crowd bearing down upon us, Miss Manette, and I see them by the lightning. He added the last words after there had been a vivid flash which had shown him lounging in the window. And I hear them, he added, after a peal of thunder. Here they come, fast, fierce, and furious. It was the rush and roar of the rain that he typified, and it stopped him, for no voice could be heard in it. A memorable storm of thunder and lightning broke with that sweep of water, and there was not a moment's interval in a crash and fire and rain until after the moon rose at midnight. The great bell of St. Paul's was striking 1 in the cleared air when Mr. Lorry, escorted by Jerry, high-booted and bearing a lantern, set forth on his return passage to Clerkenwell. There were solitary patches of road on the way between Soho and Clerkenwell, and Mr. Lorry, mindful of footpaths, always retained Jerry for his service, though it was usually performed a good 2 hours earlier. What a night it has been, almost a night, Jerry, said Mr. Lorry, to bring the dead out of their graves. So Lorry is talking about it's rained so much this particular night, the storm, that it could exhume or lift dead bodies out of their graves. I never see the night myself, master, nor yet I don't expect to. What would that do? Answered Jerry. So Jerry's like, oh, I never go out at night. But what do we know? Good night, Mr. Carton, said the man of business. Good night, Mr. Darnay. Shall we ever see such a night again together? Perhaps, perhaps. See the great crowd of people with its rush and roar bearing down upon them, too. So that last little bit is kind of like a little add-in from Charles Dickens, right? So it's not anything that the characters are saying, but it's Dickens just talking. So again, think about the rain and the echoes and the footsteps and what all of that could possibly mean. That's it.